All right, everybody, it's cuffing season, which means it's time to talk about relationships. I'm going to roll out a relationship model for you today to get you to start to think about your relationship or what you're looking for in a relationship in a new way. It takes love to grow old with someone. And I hear this a lot. Like, I want someone to grow old with, or I could imagine growing old with this person. That requires love. But it takes something different to create a life with someone. It takes guts. And so this is why I call the relationship model that I'm about to present to you a heroic relationship model, because it does require that each person is committed not only to growth within the relationship, but their individual growth, and assessing where are they blocking both their individual missions for life, their goals for life, and the joint missions that they have as a family or as a partner unit. So here we go. We're going to get into each of the different aspects of this heroic relationship. I hope you stay tuned. So in my book, I call doing the work, right? Essentially entering into your inner world to take a look at how our experience shape our here and now, to process trauma and grief, and to work with the inner workings of the psyche, how we think, how our mind and body respond to our life before us. The work, I call that your hero's twirl. So the acronym that we use for heroic relationship, or the rules for engagement, you might say, spells out to co-twirls. This is the acronym. So the first is C. C is co-regulating. So heroic relationships, both parties help to co-regulate one another. What does that mean? Co-regulating means that each person tries to help the other one tune their nervous system. So our survival responses to life are cued up by our autonomic nervous system. So our fight-flight responses, those difficult emotions that we experience where they can overwhelm the senses, all have to do with how our nervous system is perceiving our environment. Now, our nervous system can be regulated through other people, and there are several ways that can happen. The first is physical touch. So I've had partners in the past that know, like, when I get this glazed look in my eye, like, all I need is a hug. I don't need you to walk through what we could do about this situation, how we can problem solve. I literally just need a hug and my whole body will relax and I'm ready to go out there and to solve the mission, right? Like, that's what I needed. That's what I needed was touch. Tone can also help to soothe the nervous system. So a gentle tone. If your partner comes home and is really stressed about something and you're able to keep a calm tone, that's going to also help to co-regulate them, to help them to tune their nervous system. Another feature, which I think is really cool, is presence helps us to co-regulate with another person. For example, I have clients that I work with where we meditate together, and there's a reason for that. We have mirror neurons in our brain, which means we're able to uptake what other people are putting out with regards to energy. So when I meditate with someone in session, they can feel my calmness. They can feel that I'm at peace, and it helps for them to tune their own nervous system to that energy and to that frequency, you can say, because of mirror neurons. So these are some ways we can help one another to co-regulate in relationships. So heroic relationships, each person is committed to helping the other to co-regulate. What John Bowlby, who is the father of attachment theory, calls to become a secure base for one another, a recharging station during life's storms. Right? Now, there may be couples where one person needs to co-regulate more than another, and that really has to do with attachment and maybe trauma history. And that's fine. But ideally, we do want to be able to kind of like pass the buck when it comes to co-regulating, right? It's really important that we try to share this with one another, that we try to share the responsibility here. And I think that that's something important to know. Otherwise, we get into kind of this codependent dynamic where one person is just constantly co-regulating the other person. And I don't think that is helpful. I think an interdependent dynamic where we're both dependent on one another, but we swap, is a much more healthy setup. Now, part of co-regulating also has to do with taking accountability and responsibility for regulating ourselves. In my book, I call this basic training, which is what are the arsenals of sort of tools that you have in your back pocket to help you to emotionally regulate so that you can show up for a partner, right? In the book, like, I talk about why this is important for you just as a human being and as an individual in general. But in this case, what are some of the tools that can help us to show up better for our loved ones? If I came home after losing my job and were to tell my loved one, like, hey, I lost my job today, and they would become elevated and were like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. What are we gonna do? That's not gonna be helpful. That's going to compromise our mission, right? Let's say if I'm the head earner for the household. What's more supportive is if I come home and I say, I think I'm gonna lose my job, and I'm frantic and I'm anxious, for my partner to have developed enough of an arsenal, a strong enough arsenal for them to be able to regulate themselves, to show up for me and to say, like, okay, I think we can talk this through, to help me calm myself so that we can come together, we can troubleshoot, and then we can accomplish whatever the mission is for our financial and our survival needs. The next characteristic of a heroic relationship is on time. So what I mean by that is heroic relationships, people in these relationships show up for one another. They don't continue to kick the ball down the hill and say, well, we'll resource your needs when. Matthew Hussey, who is a relationship coach, and I love his material, he's got really smart material, says the person who's right for you is both right and ready. Right? So I've seen so often in my personal life and with my clients, people who are willing to freeze time in order to maintain their attachments to someone. If you have someone in your life, or if you are partnered with someone who is not prioritizing your needs now, what makes you think that they will in 5, 10, 15 years from now? Listen, I understand that things come up, traumas do happen, and there are times where we do need to amend our expectations and our needs for our partners in a relationship. But in general, our relationships are on time when they're heroic. Okay, the next aspect is called turning towards. John Gottman is a really famous psychologist in my field who studies successful relationships and has published several books on what constitutes a healthy and long-lasting relationship. And one of the qualities that is super important is called turning towards. So Gottman has this really great story that he gives in one of his books where he talks about being in bed and reading a mystery novel and being on, like, I think it was like one of the third or fourth final pages of the book and being consumed by it. And as he's reading one of the final pages of the book, his wife walks into the bedroom and then into the bathroom to start brushing her and getting ready for bed. And he lifts up his head momentarily and he notices that she looks so sad, like there's something wrong. And in that moment, he realizes he has an opportunity to betray or to connect. Turning towards is about connecting. It's about doing what he did next, which is he got out of bed, he put his book down, and he went inside and started brushing her hair and asked her, what's wrong? This is an opportunity, right? The little opportunities during the day to connect with someone versus betray trust. When we see that something's going on with our partners and we don't bother to ask them, or when it's inconvenient for us to address an issue, these are the ways that we betray our partners, right? We betray trust. We betray their faith in us to show up for them, to be there. So turning towards really means we take both day-to-day actions in order to acknowledge our partners, their needs in that moment, and also over time, we turn towards our partner during times of conflict or distress, right? We want to always turn back towards the relationship in order to work through things. So turning towards might be as simple as, like, you lift up your head when your partner is talking to you from scrolling on your phone, right? That would be an example of turning towards your partner versus away. Okay, the next component of a heroic relationship is W, willing. So our willingness to express our needs, our willingness to express our feelings, and our willingness to take accountability, and our willingness to apologize. So oftentimes in relationships, we want to assume that our partners know what we're thinking, feeling, and what our needs are. And the reason why we want to assume these things is because it exonerates us and frees us from the responsibility of having to articulate our feelings and having to ask for what we need, which can feel uncomfortable. So Heroic relationships, we take accountability for how we're feeling, we take accountability for what our needs are, and we make requests of our partners, and we also are willing to take accountability for when we mess up, because we all will, and we're willing to apologize. I think nonviolent communication offers us a really great model for expressing our feelings and our needs in relationships. And I'm going to give you an example of this, though I feel like I should probably do a whole video on nonviolent communication because it's freaking awesome. But you can let me know if this resonates or not. So nonviolent communication sounds something like this. First, it starts with what we're observing. So, for example, when you raise your voice like that, or when you avoid my questions, right? These are observations. It's not like when you were being a jerk. That's not an observation. So we start with an observation. Then we connect that to a feeling. When you raised your voice, it made me feel afraid, or it made me feel sad, right? Whatever the feeling is. The next step is attaching the feeling to a need. So we have all different kinds of needs. I will typically break down our needs into two categories, which are survival needs, food, shelter, human connection, and then ecstasy needs, which really fall under the category of like things that make us come alive. So what actually allows us to participate in our lives in a creative way, let's say. That's also another video. But so our needs in this moment, right? So the need might be when you raise your voice, it makes me feel afraid and it compromises my need to connect to you and be understood by you in this moment. Okay, so that's the third component, is what is the need. The fourth is making a request. So it might be, would you be willing to take a time out when things get heated and talk to me later? Or would you be willing to think about this or talk through this with me, right? That's a request. Another option too is to tell the story that to share the story that is kind of running through our mind mentally with our partner. So that might sound something like, when you raise your voice, the story that I'm telling myself is that you don't really care about what I think or how I feel about this situation. Would you be willing to talk this through with me? So that'd be an example of how we use nonviolent communication to articulate feelings, to articulate needs, and to make requests of our partners so that there's no guesswork, right? As much as you might want your partner to just assume things about you, this actually makes you more courageous and it makes you stronger articulating these needs, and it allows and frees the other person up from having to do guesswork or do a dance with you, right? So that both of you can live in integrity and honesty with one another. All right, this next one is a little more fun and sexy. It's imaginative. So heroic relationships are imaginative. Couples therapist Esther Perel has this amazing quote in her book, Mating in Captivity, and I might botch it, but the essence of the quote is that we neutralize our complexity in order to maintain our coupledom in relationship. What does that really mean? It means that we keep the characters in our life flat and predictable in order to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable in those relationships. We stop being curious about our partners. We stop wondering about them, right? So Esther Perel has two sort of paradoxical desires that she lays out in this book that she talks about that people want in their long-term partnerships. On the one hand, we want security, and on the other hand, we want aliveness, we want eroticism, we want mystery. But the reality is that eroticism and mystery and excitement and adventure sort of conflict with this idea of security and comfort, which is all things known, right? So heroic relationships attempt to toggle and attempt to straddle these two worlds. And how do they do that? Each person is committed to being curious about the other person long after the honeymoon phase is over. And each person is not only curious, but invested in different forms of play with the other person. And I'm not just talking about sexual play, although that can be part of an erotic life with a partner and an imaginative life. I'm also just talking about seeing life as an adventure together and seeing your partner's inner world as a place to explore, again, not only in the first few years of coupledom, but in many years after. So I'm going to share with you, my parents had a ritual every Saturday. They had a date night. And I really feel like it helped to facilitate an imaginative process because they had a rule for their date night, which was whatever they did, wherever they went, they were not allowed to talk about their kids. So any sort of issue that any of us were having was like off the table. They had to explore each other as a man and woman, independent of their role as father and as a mother. And I do think that this weekly date night where they were able to relinquish their roles and they were able to explore one another and remain curious about one another was a really huge element or kind of glue in holding them together as a couple and the success of their relationship. All right, R, revisiting difficult moments and rescripting them. So heroic relationships are not afraid to enter into conflict. They're not afraid to discuss issues they may have had in the past. And I would argue heroic relationships are not only unafraid of revisiting these issues, but they are also committed to rescripting their issues. And what do I mean by rescripting their issues? I mean, they're able to go back and review life events, review difficult times they have had, and to re-narrate the tale. You know, for example, remember those years early on in our relationship and things were crazy and your mother was doing X, Y, and Z and we somehow got through it? Or, you know, this thing happening in our marriage really strengthened us, even though during the time it felt like really dismal. Or do you remember the time that we broke up and I missed you so much? And it was a huge learning opportunity for me. And I realized like, I don't want to do this whole life thing without you, right? Like these are examples of intentionally turning towards each other to rescript difficult moments and also turning towards one another to work through these moments together. Now I want to make a point here. Rescripting is a like team effort thing. Like you don't get to rescript a moment if you were the one who messed up and you haven't apologized for it, right? Like rescripting happens after accountability has been taken and after both parties are actively working to reconstruct and are moving forward. So again, like if you're the person who like did something to compromise trust in the relationship and you're trying to get your person to rescript with you, that's unfair and you're being unreasonable. So this happens after the fact and after we have worked through and taken accountability for some of the hurts that maybe have gone on in the relationship, but it's a joint process and it's a humbling and a bonding process to do this. Okay, the next thing is heroic relationships are liberal and generous when it comes to resourcing one another with needs. So we all have different needs in relationships, and I've encountered a lot of people who assume that what they need is similar to what their partner needs. Like it's like somehow the same thing. Like I need this and so they must need that too. And that's not the case. We all have different needs in general and we all have different needs in relationships. So heroic relationships are committed to understanding what needs are important to the other person and doing their best to resource those needs. Now, we can't all fulfill all of our partner's needs, but we can attempt to fulfill the needs that they have in intimate relationship with us. So I think Gary Chapman has great resources when it comes to figuring out the ways that our partners like to receive love from us. So Chapman has a famous book called The 5 Love Languages. These are gift giving, acts of service, quality time, words of affirmation, and physical touch. So these are the ways that we like to give and receive love. Taylor Tomlinson in her new stand-up says that gift giving is really to weed out all of the assholes. And that's not true because I have a lot of people in my life who actually are gift givers and who like receiving gifts and they're delightful, but it still is funny. And another model that I think is really great when it comes to resourcing our partners with needs is Jaya May's erotic blueprint model. It's essentially love languages for your arousal. It's essentially like your pleasure blueprint. So she has different categories of things that turn people on, how they like to be aroused in their relationships. And I think this is a really good resource for couples too, to discern, okay, like, what is it that turns you on? What are the ways that you like to receive love? And can we resource one another and work together to get our needs met? Okay, so the last component of a heroic relationship is my favorite because it's sweet, and I'm a sucker, which is storytelling. So people in heroic relationships are storytellers, meaning they derive pleasure and they bond through stories they tell about their relationship. We are homonarrative beings, meaning we derive meaning from our stories. So people in heroic relationships like talking to one another about their stories, the important stories. So I don't know if any of you have seen When Harry Met Sally. If you haven't, you must see it because it's my favorite. But in that movie, it's a rom-com, and throughout it, there are like all of these clips of older couples talking about how they met their loved one. You know, it's like, I met her when she was the head camp counselor at the girls' camp, and I was the camp counselor at the boys' camp. It's cute, whatever. But point being that these stories, when we met, that sexy night, do you remember when? Right? These are the things that bond us together. So heroic couples invest in storytelling. They also invest in creating space for their partner to share their stories. That goes back to turning towards and also creating space for the imagination in our relationships. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope it gears you up to either up the ante in your relationships and focus on some of these things, as well as helps to clarify maybe some of the things that you're looking to create and sustain in a heroic relationship.